The robes were on the kitchen table when Uncle Vernon came home. Harry had been careful with them, set the paper bag from Madame Malkin's on the far edge of the table, nowhere near anything important, kept his hands at his sides, and made himself small against the counter. He had spent 11 years in this house, becoming very good at small. It hadn't helped. Vernon came through the door, saw the bag, saw Harry standing beside it, and set his briefcase down with a measured deliberateness that was, in its own way, louder than anything he could have said. "What is that?" Not a question. Harry had spent enough years in Vernon Dursley's kitchen to know the difference. "Robes," he said. "For school. They were on the list." "I know what they are." Vernon crossed to the table. He looked inside the bag, and the colour rose in his neck and settled in his face, that familiar flush that meant a decision had already been made. "You will not," he said, quite flatly, "wear those under my roof." Petunia had appeared in the doorway by then, tea-towel in hand, reading her husband's face the way she always did. She said nothing. Dudley drifted in behind her with a half-eaten biscuit, registered that nothing interesting was happening to him personally, and retreated. "He'll go dressed like a person," Vernon said, "or he won't go at all." He pushed the bag along the counter. "Find him something of Dudley's." "Vernon, normal clothing. If they notice at that school, that's between them and their kind." The Madame Malkin robes went on to the high shelf in Vernon's wardrobe. "For safekeeping," he said. Harry received, over the following 2 days, 3 pairs of Dudley's discarded trousers, 4 of his old shirts, and a grey-green jumper with a fraying elbow that had been boxed up since Christmas before last. Petunia drove to a charity shop 2 towns over, and came back with a robe of the kind a child might wear in a school nativity, grey, a little short in the sleeve, the fabric thin enough that the shapes beneath it showed through if the light was behind him. This was determined to be acceptable. Wizard enough for the platform, not so wizard that it had to be tolerated inside the house. It was not what Hagrid had imagined, Harry thought. Hagrid, who had stood with him in Madame Malkin's and watched the robes measured and folded and wrapped, who had bought Harry's wand and his owl and his books, who had behaved throughout the entire day as though Harry's happiness was simply the correct and natural state of things. Hagrid hadn't imagined this part. Harry had watched the bag get shelved and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not be punished later, and he had learned that particular arithmetic very young. Vernon dropped him at King's Cross without ceremony and drove away before Harry had his trunk properly on the pavement. Harry stood in the noise of the departures hall, with his trolley canted slightly to the left, and his ticket to a platform that didn't officially exist tucked in his front pocket, and he felt the particular smallness of being 11 years old and unwatched and quite alone in a crowd. Then he pushed through the barrier, and the smallness lifted. On the Hogwarts Express, somewhere past Reading, a boy with red hair and a smudge of something on his nose asked if he could sit down, because everywhere else was full. His name was Ron Weasley. He had 4 older brothers who had all been at Hogwarts and talked about it the way people talk about a place they have longed for without quite admitting it to themselves. He had a rat called Scabbers wedged into his jacket pocket, apparently in a coma, and he shared his mother's sandwiches without being asked. Harry liked him immediately and entirely. Ron noticed the robe eventually. Harry caught it, a quick sideways glance at the grey fabric, the sleeve a little short, and then Ron looked out the window with the studied concentration of someone who had decided something was none of his business. Harry was grateful for it. He had spent years being noticed for things he'd rather have gone unmarked. This was different, this noticing and choosing not to, but it still left a small clench in his chest that he folded away and left there. "Do you know which house you'll be in?" Ron asked. No. Do you? Gryffindor, most likely. Everyone in my family's been Gryffindor. He said it with the particular pride of someone managing a quiet, private worry. My mum reckons you can practically see it coming. Harry thought about this, and about what it might be like to have a mother who reckoned things about you. A girl appeared at the compartment door before he could say anything to either of those thoughts. Bushy brown hair, very large front teeth, and the air of someone who had read every available book on the subject and arrived to inspect the field conditions. Hermione Granger, she said. And had they read their school books? Because she had, all of them. And also could she see Harry's wand, and also his glasses had a smudge on the left lens. She sat down without being invited. Ron gave Harry a look. Harry tried not to smile. She did not appear to notice the robe. Hermione, Harry would come to understand, observed everything, but arranged her observations in a hierarchy, and a slightly shabby outer robe ranked low when there were spells to be discussed and subjects to be previewed. The Great Hall was everything Hagrid had described, and more than Harry had been able to properly picture. Thousands of candles floated above 4 long tables, the ceiling moving with real cloud and dark sky, the smell of something warm drifting up from dishes that appeared out of nothing. Harry walked in at the end of the column of first years and felt, for one strange, unguarded moment, as though he had come home to somewhere he had never been. The Sorting Hat gave a speech about the houses, and then the names were called, and the hall went a particular quiet when Harry's was read out, that specific quality of silence that he was already beginning to recognize as his own particular soundtrack. The hat came down over his ears and went still, then murmured things he couldn't entirely make out. Something about courage, something about a mind worth placing carefully. It arrived at Gryffindor with the finality of a decision made. The table to the left roared. Harry sat down with his heart very loud in his chest. He ate things he had not been permitted at Privet Drive. He listened to an older student explain the points system. He watched Dumbledore rise at the end of the feast and make a speech that was warm and pleasantly eccentric, and touched, almost humorously, on the subject of a forbidden third-floor corridor, in a way that Harry suspected was rather more serious than the delivery suggested. No one looked at his clothing. They looked at his scar, or very deliberately away from it, and Harry sat inside the familiar weight of being looked at sideways, and held himself still, and let the hall settle around him like something he was slowly, quietly, beginning to learn the shape of. The dormitory was at the top of a spiral staircase. 5 4-poster beds, red curtains, a window that looked out over the dark grounds and the faint silver gleam of the lake. Harry sat on the edge of the bed nearest the window and pressed one hand flat on the mattress and kept it there. He had slept on a camp bed in a cupboard for as long as his memory reached. A proper bed still felt like something he might be told he'd misunderstood. Ron came in from the bathroom and dropped onto his own bed and exhaled at the ceiling. Harry changed with his back mostly turned. He was not quite quick enough. He heard Ron go still. The jumper was the worst of it. Old and too large, the sleeves dropping past Harry's wrists, the worn elbow catching the lamplight. The trousers were Dudley's, belted 3 notches too tight. It was not poverty, exactly, or not only that. There was something in the specific ill fit that was different from just being poor. Something that looked decided rather than accidental. Something that said, to the right pair of eyes, that someone had chosen for this to be what Harry wore. Ron said nothing. He was examining a loose thread on his blanket with absolute attention. "Good night," Harry said. "Yeah." Ron's voice came out slightly rough. "Night." Harry got into bed and pulled the curtain closed. The mattress held him. Outside, An owl called once and went quiet. On the other side of the curtain he could hear Ron lying still, not sleeping, the small, careful sounds of someone thinking something through that they hadn't yet decided whether to say. Neither of them said anything else, but the silence had a shape to it now, like the outline of something that had been seen and recognized and quietly, carefully, set aside for later. The dungeon smelled of cold stone and something else beneath it. Sulphur, maybe, or the memory of things burned. Harry filed in with the rest of the first-year Gryffindors and found a seat beside Ron at one of the long black workbenches, and felt, for reasons he couldn't have named precisely, that this was not going to be his favorite room. Professor Snape arrived without ceremony. He came through a side door and moved to the front of the classroom the way a shadow moves, something that is simply there before you've noticed it traveling, and looked out at them all with an expression that suggested he had expected to be disappointed and was already preparing to be proved right. He called the register in a voice like something pouring slowly. When he reached Harry's name, he paused just briefly, in a way that managed to be louder than anything he might have said. "Our celebrity." Snape let the register rest against the bench. "Harry Potter." He looked at Harry with dark, flat eyes. "I'd heard you'd finally arrived in the wizarding world. We have been waiting with such anticipation." Harry said nothing. He had learned at Privet Drive that the correct response to this particular tone was silence. Snape's gaze moved over him with a kind of deliberate patience, the way a person reads a notice they already expected to find dull. It stopped, just noticeably, at his collar, the collar of the grey robe, visible above the open neck of Dudley's second-best shirt. Harry felt the blood move in his face, but held himself still. "Tell me," Snape said, "where would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar?" Harry hadn't read ahead. He shook his head, and Snape received this with the satisfaction of a man whose expectations had been precisely met. He turned away as though the matter was comfortably settled, and the silence in the room had a particular quality to it, the silence of 20 children deciding whether to feel relieved or guilty that it wasn't them. Snape let it sit for a moment before he continued, his voice carrying the unhurried weight of someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. "What a surprise. I had imagined the famous Harry Potter would have had more time for his studies. Between the interviews, presumably, the public appearances." A brief pause. The wardrobe considerations. At the Slytherin table, they'd been combined with the Slytherin first years, which Harry was already beginning to recognize as structurally unkind. Draco Malfoy laughed. Not loudly. It was the laugh of someone who has identified the correct response to a social moment and deployed it accurately. Crabbe and Goyle followed suit, slightly behind, the way echoes are always slightly behind. Ron's jaw tightened. Harry could see it in his peripheral vision. "Monkshood," Hermione said suddenly, from 2 seats to Harry's left. Her hand was up. "A bezoar is a stone from the stomach of a goat. It counteracts most poisons. Monkshood and wolfsbane are the same plant, also known as aconite." Snape regarded her for a moment. 5 points from Gryffindor, Miss Granger, for speaking without being called upon. The silence in the classroom changed quality entirely. Hermione's hand descended. "Since Mr. Potter was unable to enlighten us," Snape said, returning to the register, "I will note that fame, clearly, is no substitute for preparation. We will proceed." Harry spent the rest of the lesson chopping ingredients with more precision than he usually gave to anything, because the chopping gave him somewhere to put his hands and his attention and the hot, uncomfortable feeling behind his sternum that was not quite anger and not quite embarrassment, and was worse than either. He did not look at Malfoy. He did not look at Snape. He kept his eyes on the lacewing flies in front of him, and breathed slowly through his nose, and thought about nothing in particular until his heartbeat settled. Ron caught up with him in the corridor outside, and the verdict he delivered, that Snape was awful, that taking points from Hermione for being right was simply beyond the pale, came out with the quiet certainty of someone who had been sitting on it for 50 minutes and could no longer contain it. Harry agreed, both times, because he did, and because he didn't have better words for it than that. He wasn't sure better words existed. Hermione caught up with them a moment later, her book bag hitting her hip with every stride. Her face had the particular set expression of someone managing wounded dignity through sheer organizational effort. It was still correct, she said, to no one in particular. The information was correct. He knew it was correct. He knew, Harry agreed. She looked at him sideways, surprised, perhaps, that he hadn't qualified it. Then she nodded once and didn't say anything else, and the three of them walked back toward the main stairs with the unhappy solidarity of people who have survived the same weather. It was 2 weeks into term when Hermione found the sink. She'd come down to the girls' bathroom before breakfast, the lower one, not the one on the second floor that was already developing a particular reputation, and stopped in the doorway because there was someone already there, back to her, shoulders moving with the concentrated effort of someone doing something by hand that they were trying to finish quickly. Harry, standing at the basin in Dudley's old trousers and a shirt that was wrong in 12 different ways, too wide across the shoulders, too long in the arm, the buttons mismatched where one had been replaced at some point by someone who had settled for approximately the right color. He was washing something, working soap through the fabric with the efficiency of someone for whom this was simply a task with a correct method, not a thing that required thought. He heard her and turned. The thing in his hands was a pair of muggle undershorts, washed thin, the elastic replaced at some point, quite clearly not new and quite clearly cared for, with scrupulous attention, precisely because replacement was not an option. Hermione had spent her summer reading Hogwarts, a history and the standard book of spells and everything else on the list, and she had also, because she was Hermione Granger, read several books that were not on any list. One of them had been about children in difficult circumstances. She had read it because knowledge felt like preparation, and preparation felt like safety. She had not expected, standing in a first-floor bathroom on a Thursday morning, to recognize what she was looking at. She apologized and left. She did not wait to hear his answer, because she had seen his face go neutral in the particular way a face goes neutral when neutrality is a skill, and she understood that the kindest thing she could do in that moment was remove herself from the room. She stood in the corridor with her book bag and waited until the sound of water stopped, and then she walked very purposefully in the direction of breakfast and did not mention it to anyone until she had thought it through properly, which took her 3 days. On the 4th day, she found Ron in the common room after charms, when Harry had gone to return a borrowed quill to Seamus, and she sat down across from him and said, "The clothing isn't from Diagon Alley." Ron looked up from his transfiguration notes. "His robes," she said. "His underclothes. None of it is. Someone's chosen it for him." She paused, or chosen not to. Ron put his quill down. He looked at his notes for a moment, and then he said, quietly, that he knew. He'd seen it the first night, when Harry was changing, and he hadn't said anything. The way he said it, not as a confession, but as a statement of fact, delivered to the middle distance, made it clear that the decision not to say anything had been deliberate, and that he had not changed his mind about it. There was something in his voice that Hermione recognized, the particular flatness of someone who has been sitting with a difficult thing long enough that the shock of it has worn smooth, leaving only the weight. Hermione said she hadn't either. She wasn't sure why that mattered, but it did. The symmetry of it. The fact that they had both seen and both chosen silence, independently, for the same reasons. They sat with that for a moment, the shared knowledge and the shared silence around it, and then she said that she didn't think they should press him. Ron agreed with the conviction of someone who had made up his mind a fortnight ago and had not wavered. He had 5 older brothers. He understood, in the bone, the difference between someone who wanted help and someone who needed time before they could accept it. The conversation that followed was brief and practical, the kind of conversation that 2 people have when they have already done most of the thinking separately and are now only comparing notes. They could not make it harder. They could share things. They could not make a point of it. Ron had been doing that already, in small ways. More of his mother's shortbread than he could manage, offered without comment, the extra parchment pushed across the table without ceremony. Hermione had a second bottle of ink she could leave on the bench next time. Neither of them said anything else about it. They went back to their separate work, and when Harry returned with the borrowed quill and sat back down and asked Ron how the transfiguration diagram was coming along, everything was entirely normal. The way it had been determined, it would be. Quietly and without ceremony, and with a great deal of feeling beneath the surface of it that none of the 3 of them had the vocabulary for yet. Hagrid's hut appeared in the same clearing every time, reassuringly unchanged, a structure that had long since stopped pretending to be architecturally sound and arrived, instead, at a certain weathered authority. Harry knocked on the enormous door with his knuckles and waited while something inside rearranged itself, and then Hagrid pulled the door open, and the smell of wood smoke and dog and something boiling came out to meet him. "Harry!" The delight in Hagrid's voice was the same as it had been in Diagon Alley, uncalibrated, entire. "Come in. Come in. You'll have a cup of something." Harry came in. Fang deposited his enormous head immediately into Harry's lap as soon as he sat, which was less a greeting than a structural inevitability. Hagrid was making tea with movements that suggested fine motor control was more of an aspiration than an achievement, and he turned to hand Harry a mug. The mug was roughly the size of a bucket, and stopped. He looked at Harry for a moment, just at the robe and what was visible beneath it where the collar sat open, and then at Harry's face. He had eyes that were very small for the size of the face around them, and very sharp for their size, and they were, right now, doing something that Harry recognized from mirrors, the thing where something is being recognized and made sense of. "Malkin's stuff isn't fitting quite right," Hagrid said, carefully, in the tone of someone trying a door to see if it opens. "It's fine," Harry said. He scratched Fang's ear. "He doesn't seem to mind my robes." Hagrid looked at him for another moment. The thing he was doing with his face was not quite deciding. He looked at the mug in Harry's hands, at the way the cuff of Dudley's shirt fell past Harry's wrist, and then he turned back to the fire and said nothing else. Harry was grateful for it in the way he was becoming grateful for a lot of things at Hogwarts, the way people noticed and chose, carefully, where to put their noticing. The tea was terrible. Harry drank all of it. October arrived like a door closing. The mornings went grey and cold, and the lake in the early light looked like hammered pewter. Students pulled their robes tighter on the way to class. Harry had nothing to pull tighter, the charity shop grey not being built for this sort of weather, but he had Dudley's old jumper in several thin layers beneath it, and he had learned a long time ago not to let cold show on his face. It was a small skill, and not a happy one, but it was his. He thought about the Philosopher's Stone on the way to Charms. Dumbledore had said it plainly enough on the first night, the third-floor corridor, off-limits to those who did not wish to die painfully, and then smiled as though he had said something pleasantly eccentric. Harry had filed this away and returned to his pork chops, but the week since had layered more on top of it. Snape's leg, which he had been nursing since early September, something that Hermione had noticed, and Ron had not, or at least had not mentioned. The way the defense against the dark arts classroom had begun, subtly, to smell strange. The stone itself, whatever it was. Hermione had found the reference in the library before Harry had finished framing the question. Nicholas Flamel, alchemist, the last known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. She had set the book on the table between them with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something breakable. That had been a Tuesday. By Thursday, they had 3 more books open, and a system. Ron's contribution to the system was to sit at the end of the row and look casual, which was more useful than it sounded, because Madame Pince had developed a specific awareness of the 3 of them that warranted management. Harry's contribution was to find the passages that mattered. Hermione's was everything else, but she did not put it in those terms. They were 3 weeks into this project, comfortable with the shape of each other's working habits, when Halloween arrived. The great hall was hung with hundreds of live bats. The pumpkins were enormous and carved with expressions too complex for pumpkins, and the smell of treacle tart and roasting meat was warm enough against the night that it was almost possible to ignore the thunder that had been building over the lake all afternoon. Peeves had already caused 2 incidents. The mood was elevated in a way that Harry had learned, in the years of Dudley's birthdays, to find slightly exhausting. The particular brightness of other people's anticipation, which you could appreciate without quite sharing. He was managing the treacle tart with every intention of going back for more when Professor Quirrell burst through the doors. His turban was askew, which it never was. His face was the specific white of someone who has forgotten how to manage what is happening to their body. He said, in a voice that cracked on the first syllable and never recovered, "Troll. In the dungeons. Thought you ought to know." Then he dropped, which was dramatic, and the great hall did several things at once. Harry did not remember crossing the hall. He remembered Ron's shoulder against his in the corridor, and he remembered thinking of Hermione. Hermione, who had gone to the girls' bathroom before dinner and hadn't come back, who didn't know, because they had argued at the end of study period about something sufficiently stupid that Harry had stopped tracking where she'd gone. He said this to Ron. Ron said something under his breath that would have counted against him in Gryffindor's point tally, and turned down a different corridor from the flow of students. The troll was in the bathroom. The details of what happened next were somewhat impressionistic, and Harry would reconstruct them afterwards with the particular selectivity that the brain applies to moments it hasn't entirely processed. Ron's spell was instinctive and perfect and astonished him. The troll went down with a sound like a building coming off its foundations. Hermione was pressed against the sinks with plaster in her hair. The door hit the wall, and McGonagall appeared behind it, with Snape and Quirrell a half-step behind, and McGonagall's face did something rapid and complicated that resolved into very sharp concern. 5 points from Gryffindor each, said McGonagall, for being out of their dormitories. Then 10 points to each of them, Hermione having said something about it being her own fault, which Harry thought was somewhat generous and quite brave. McGonagall looked at Hermione for a moment, with an expression Harry couldn't read. Then they were shepherded back. They didn't go directly back. The alcove was off a secondary corridor. Stone bench, tapestry of an unsuccessful medieval wizard attempting to teach a badger mathematics, not particularly comfortable. But it was also around a corner from the route Peeves usually took, which mattered. They dropped into it, all 3, running on adrenaline and relief, and the particular giddiness that follows having nearly been flattened. Ron kept turning his wand over in his hands. Hermione had plaster dust on her collar and was not addressing it. She addressed Harry instead. "Your clothes," she said. "The real ones, I mean." She said it steadily, not unkindly, the way she delivered facts she had already confirmed to herself. "They weren't bought for you." Harry went very still. Ron looked at the tapestry. He did not look like someone hearing new information. "I know," Hermione said, more quietly. "I saw you in the bathroom. The first floor one." A brief pause. "I didn't say anything, but I haven't stopped thinking about it." Harry studied the stone floor. The floor was very old and did not require study, but it was there. "They made me," he said. His voice came out level. He'd had years of practice at level. "My aunt and uncle. Everything from Diagon Alley went on a shelf. Dudley grew out of these a while ago, so..." He lifted one shoulder. The gesture meant, "You understand." He thought they did. The silence had a texture to it. "Your proper robes are on the shelf," Ron said. Not a question. "Top shelf. Vernon's wardrobe." Ron made a sound. It was not a word, but it communicated quite a lot. "They know you're at Hogwarts," Hermione said. "They know you're a wizard, and they still..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Harry had noticed that Hermione, when very angry, occasionally went quiet, which was the opposite of what most people did. "They've always been like that," Harry said. "It's nothing." "Don't," said Ron. He wasn't looking at the tapestry anymore. "Don't say it's nothing." He said it without heat, which made it land differently than heat would have. Harry said nothing else. The alcove was cold, and the sounds of the castle settling moved around them. "We won't tell anyone," Hermione said. We're not going to do that to you." She paused. "But we're also not going to just do nothing." What they did, in practice, was quiet and calibrated, and arrived without ceremony. Mrs. Weasley's package came on a Tuesday, with 4 pairs of thick winter socks, and a note that said Ron had mentioned his were wearing out. Ron passed 2 pairs to Harry with the air of a person resolving a logistical problem. Hermione's spare bottle of ink became a spare quill, then a slightly too long scarf that she had bought, she said, in the wrong size and couldn't return. Small things, never once held up to be looked at. Harry received them the way they were offered, without comment, without ceremony, though something in him that had been keeping its own tally took note of each one. He turned the scarf over in his hands on the night it arrived. It was green, which Hermione had clearly not thought through from a house colours perspective, but it was very warm. He thought about the stone. He thought about the 3rd floor. He thought about Snape's limp and the look on Quirrell's face that had not, if he was honest, been entirely explained by the troll. The investigation felt important now, in a way it had felt merely interesting before, as though the night's events had sharpened something. He put the scarf down and picked up his notes. He was still less alone than he'd been a month ago, and that was the shape of the thing, and he did not know quite what to do with it yet. But there it was. He folded it away, like the cold, like everything else that was too large for the moment, and returned to his work. The notes were spread across 3 library tables by the time November arrived, which was either a sign of progress or a sign that they had lost control of the project. Hermione had color-coded the parchment by subject, red for the stone itself, blue for Flamel, green for anything that touched on Quirrell or Snape, and the green pile had been growing in a way that made Harry uneasy when he looked at it directly. He was looking at it now, in the particular grey light of a Sunday afternoon, while Ron worked through a transfiguration problem at the far end of the table, and Hermione cross-referenced 2 books simultaneously, with the focused intensity of someone defusing something. The library was quiet. Madame Pince had passed their table twice and found nothing to object to, which was its own kind of achievement. Snape was in the corridor again last night, Harry said, without looking up from his notes. "Third floor. I saw him coming back from the direction of the door." Hermione set one of her books down. "You're certain it was the third floor?" "I know what floor I'm on." "I'm not questioning your spatial awareness," she said, with the patience of someone who had learned to specify. "I'm asking whether he came from the door specifically, or just from that general direction." Harry thought about it. The corridor had been dark, and he'd been returning from the bathroom at an hour that didn't bear examination, and Snape had been moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who did not expect to be observed. "The door," he said. "Or close enough." Ron looked up from his transfiguration problem. "So he's been in there." "Or he's been trying to get in," Hermione said. "Which isn't the same thing." She pulled the green pile toward her and began sorting through it with quick, precise movements. "The protection on the stone isn't just the door. Dumbledore said multiple enchantments. If Snape's been attempting to get through them, he might not have succeeded yet." "That's meant to be reassuring," Ron said. "It's meant to be accurate." Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which was vaulted and indifferent. The thing that kept snagging at him, the thing he hadn't said aloud yet, because saying it aloud would require him to think about it properly, was Quirrell. Snape's behavior was explicable, in a dark sort of way. Snape was the kind of person who might want a powerful object for reasons Harry didn't want to examine too closely. But Quirrell had fainted in the Great Hall on Halloween, and the troll had been in the dungeons, and the troll had been a distraction, and Harry had been turning that sequence over in his mind for 3 weeks now, like a stone he kept finding in his pocket. "Quirrell," he said. Hermione looked up. "He let the troll in," Harry said. "Or he knew about it. He was the one who told us. He came in looking terrified, and then he fainted, and everyone ran, and the troll was already in the dungeons by then." He paused. "That's not a coincidence." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the silence of two people who had been thinking the same thing, and had been waiting to see who would say it first. "I've been thinking that too," Hermione said quietly. "But it doesn't fit with the stone. If Quirrell wanted the stone, why create a distraction that draws attention to the school? Why not just—" She stopped. "Unless the distraction was for something else. Unless he needed everyone out of a specific place." "The third floor," Ron said. "Or the staff room. Or Dumbledore's office." She pressed her lips together. "We don't have enough information." Harry looked at the green pile. It had grown over the past weeks, from a few tentative notes to something that felt like evidence, though evidence of what exactly remained frustratingly unclear. Snape's limp, which had appeared in early September and was fading now, Quirrell's turban, which he never removed, and which smelled, according to Seamus, of garlic, though Seamus had a tendency toward embellishment. The way Quirrell's defense classes had a quality of performance to them, the stammer, the nervous hands, that Harry had begun to find less convincing the more he watched. He was still thinking about this when Draco Malfoy appeared at the end of the row. He had Crabbe and Goyle with him, which he usually did, the three of them moving through the library with the particular ease of people who had decided the space belonged to them. Malfoy's eyes moved across the table, the notes, the color-coded piles, Harry's face, with the quick assessment of someone cataloguing information for later use. "Potter," he said, "studying on a Sunday. How industrious." Harry said nothing. He had found, over the past 2 months, that silence was frequently the most efficient response to Malfoy, who required an audience to function properly and became slightly less certain of himself when denied one. Malfoy's gaze dropped to Harry's collar, where Dudley's shirt was visible above the robe. It lingered there for a moment, not long, but long enough to be deliberate. "Still wearing the hand-me-downs, I see," he said. "I'd heard the famous Harry Potter couldn't afford better, but I thought it was an exaggeration." "Funny," Ron said, without looking up from his transfiguration problem. "I'd heard the Malfoys bought their friends. Turns out that one wasn't an exaggeration." Crabbe made a sound. Goyle looked uncertain about whether the sound had been the correct response. Malfoy's expression shifted, something tightening around the eyes, the particular recalibration of someone who has been hit more squarely than expected. He looked at Ron for a moment, then back at Harry, and what he settled on was a smile that didn't reach anything above his mouth. "Enjoy your research," he said, and moved away down the row with Crabbe and Goyle behind him. The library settled back into its Sunday quiet. Harry looked at his notes. The hot, uncomfortable feeling was back. The one that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame and was worse than either. But it was smaller than it had been in September, and he recognized distantly that this was partly because Ron had said something before Harry had needed to decide whether to say something himself. He didn't examine this too closely. He just noted it, the way he was learning to note things, and returned to the green pile. "He's going to keep doing that," Hermione said, not unkindly. "I know," Harry said. "It doesn't make it true." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment, with the expression she sometimes wore when she was deciding whether to say more. Then she pulled the green pile back toward her and picked up her quill, and the three of them worked in silence until the light through the library windows went the color of cold tea, and Madame Pince began making pointed noises about closing time. The Quidditch pitch was enormous and cold and smelled of mud and something that might have been ambition. Harry stood at the edge of it on a Tuesday afternoon in November, holding a school broom that had seen better decades, and tried to remember that he had been invited here, that Wood had come to find him specifically, had said first year in a century with an expression of barely contained delight, had handed him a broom with the reverence of someone passing a torch. He was a seeker. He had been told this as though it explained something, and perhaps it did. The way his eyes moved, the way he tracked things at the edge of his vision, the way he had caught Neville's remembrall without thinking, purely on instinct, the way he caught most things that mattered. He mounted the broom and kicked off, and the ground fell away, and the cold hit him all at once, and he thought, "Oh." He had not expected it to feel like this. He had expected competence, perhaps, or the satisfaction of a thing done correctly. He had not expected the particular quality of the air at 30 feet, or the way the castle looked from up here, smaller and larger at once, the lake a sheet of hammered pewter, the forbidden forest a dark mass at the edge of everything. He had not expected to feel, for the first time since September, entirely and completely present in his own body. He flew until Wood called him down, and then he flew the drill again, and then again, and by the time practice ended, his hands were numb inside Dudley's old gloves, and his face was raw with cold, and he was, in some way, he couldn't have articulated, lighter than he'd been in months. He walked back to the castle with the team, listening to Wood explain the Wronski feint with the focused intensity of a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to explain it to, and thought about the stone and Quirrell and Malfoy's smile and the green pile of notes, and all of it was still there. All of it still mattered, but it was further away than it had been this morning. The sky above the pitch was going dark at the edges, and the first stars were appearing, and Harry was cold and tired and had mud on Dudley's trousers, and none of that was nothing. He thought about the scarf on his bed. Green, impractical from a house colours perspective, very warm. He went inside. The notices went up on the 15th of December, and the common room rearranged itself around them. Students clustered in front of the board with the particular energy of people organizing towards something pleasant, and by that evening, the Gryffindor dormitory had the sound of trunks being packed, latches clicking, things being squashed down, the low argument of Dean and Seamus over whose jumper was whose. Harry sat on his bed and read his charms notes a second time. He was not going home. Dumbledore had arranged it. McGonagall had confirmed it in a brief and carefully worded conversation that had communicated the essential fact without requiring either of them to say anything directly uncomfortable, and Harry had nodded and returned to his breakfast. He had felt, below the relief, something that was not quite its opposite, a flat, informational acknowledgement that his situation required adults to arrange things around it. He put that away and did not take it out again. Ron appeared in the dormitory doorway on the morning of the 16th, trunk at his feet, and said he wasn't going. Harry looked up from his book. "Your family is enormous and loud," Ron said, "and they'll manage without me." He lifted one shoulder in the gesture that meant the subject was settled. "Besides, someone has to stop you doing something stupid with those notes." Harry looked at him for a moment. Ron was examining the ceiling with great interest. "Right," Harry said. "Right," said Ron. That was the whole of it. They didn't revisit it. The castle emptied over 2 days. The express pulled out of Hogsmeade Station on the 17th, and by that evening, the Gryffindor common room held perhaps a dozen students, rattling around in a space built for 200. The fires burned higher than usual. The portraits talked more, filling the quiet. Harry found that he liked the castle better this way. Not empty, exactly, but spaced out, like a sentence with more room between the words. He and Ron developed a loose architecture of days. Mornings in the common room, sometimes with books and sometimes without. Afternoons that drifted. The library, the Quidditch pitch when the weather allowed, a lower corridor where a suit of armour had a loose pauldron that sang slightly in the draught, and that Ron found unreasonably funny. Meals in a great hall that echoed now, the staff table only partly occupied, Dumbledore absent more often than not. It was on one of those evenings, 4 days into the holidays, that Harry walked to Hagrid's. The path was cold, and the ground was frozen in the way that made each step feel final, and the smoke from Hagrid's chimney was visible from the castle steps. Fang hit Harry in the chest the moment the door opened, which was familiar by now, and Hagrid pulled the dog back with one hand and gestured Harry inside with the other, and did not ask why he'd come, which Harry appreciated. They sat with tea, and something Hagrid called a rock cake, with the confidence of a man who had never needed to defend the term. The fire was immense. Harry felt the cold coming out of his hands slowly. "You're staying the holidays, then?" Hagrid said. Not a question. "Yeah." Hagrid looked at him across the table. Then he looked at his mug. "Good," he said. "Castle's good at Christmas. Warmer than people think." Harry ate part of the rock cake, which required commitment. Outside, the wind moved across the grounds, with a sound like something looking for a way in. "Hagrid," Harry said. He'd been deciding whether to say this for 2 weeks. "When you took me to Diagon Alley, before school." He stopped, reorganizing. "Did you know about what things were like at the Dursleys?" Hagrid was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. His huge hands turned the mug around once. "I knew they weren't good people," he said carefully. Dumbledore knew that too. It was a hard choice. The protection. He paused again. "I didn't ask enough questions. I should have looked more closely." He said it without apology, which was more honest than apology would have been. "I'm sorry for that, Harry." Harry looked at the fire. The flames had the color of something decisive. "It's all right," he said, and meant most of it. Hagrid hadn't made the choice. The knowing mattered more than the not having fixed it, and Harry had enough practice distinguishing between those two things. He filed the conversation away in the part of himself where he kept things that had changed shape and needed time to settle. They stayed talking until it was properly dark, Hagrid refilling Harry's tea twice and not offering another rock cake, which showed consideration. On the 27th of December, Ron received a package from his mother. It held a jumper, dark blue, well made, a tin of fudge, and a letter that Ron read with the particular expression of someone navigating a large and opinionated household from a distance. Inside the package, separate, was a smaller package addressed to Harry in handwriting that looped generously. Inside that, a jumper the colour of pine trees, thick and soft, and a pair of socks, and a card that said, "Merry Christmas. Love, Molly," in the same looping hand. Harry looked at the jumper for a moment. "She does one every year," Ron said, without looking up from his fudge. "For everyone." Harry understood that Ron had written home and said something, and that this was how Ron did things. Not directly, but through action taken quietly before you knew to be grateful for it. He didn't say this. He just put the jumper on over Dudley's shirt, and it was very warm, and the sleeves came to exactly the right place on his wrists, which was a thing he had not experienced often. He sat with it on for the rest of the afternoon and said nothing about it. Hermione came back on the 29th, several days before term resumed, with her trunk, a new set of books, and a canvas bag that she set on the dormitory floor with studied casualness. "I picked some things up," she said, "while I was home. I thought—" She did not finish the sentence, which was uncharacteristic, but opened the bag and began extracting items with the air of someone reading a list that only they could see. A robe repair kit, a pair of quality wool socks, a second jumper, charcoal grey, plain, the kind of thing you could wear anywhere, which she set on Harry's bed without particular ceremony. "That one was in the wrong size for me," she said. "So." Harry looked at the jumper. "Thank you," he said. "It might need taking in at the shoulders," she said briskly. "Or it might not. I wasn't certain." She went to unpack, which gave Harry a reason to look away. That evening, he took the jumper upstairs and tried it on in the dormitory, standing in the space between his four-poster and Ron's. Ron was already in bed, curtains half drawn, reading, or appearing to read. The distinction mattered, and Harry had been paying attention. The jumper fit. It was the right length. The sleeves stopped where sleeves were supposed to stop. Harry sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at his hands. The too long cuffs of Dudley's shirt replaced for this moment by something that was actually his. Something that someone had chosen for him specifically. He felt his throat close, quite without permission. He did not make a sound. He sat with it, the hot pressure behind his eyes, and breathed through his nose, and let it happen in the way he'd learned to. Quickly, quietly, leaving no evidence. He was not sad, precisely. He was not sure there was a word for it. There was the jumper, and there was Molly Weasley's handwriting, and there was Hermione measuring a size in a shop somewhere, thinking of him. All of it arriving at once. He was aware, across the room, of Ron turning a page. Just the one page. Then nothing. Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, precisely, and straightened, and looked at the far wall until his breathing evened. After a while, Ron set his book down and rolled over toward the curtain, settling in the audible way of someone going to sleep. "Night," Ron said. "Night," said Harry. He folded the jumper and put it under his pillow, which was not where jumpers went, and lay in the dark and thought about Quirrell and the stone and the green pile of notes waiting in the library, and what Hagrid had said about hard choices and not asking enough questions. The anger was there, low and steady, not at Hagrid, not at anyone in this castle, at the fact of it, at the shelf in Vernon's wardrobe, and the years that had stacked up against it, and the particular neatness with which the world had arranged for no one to notice. He lay with the anger until it became something less sharp. Then he slept. Term resumed on the 3rd of January, with the particular energy of a place filling back up. Students returning in 1s and 2s through the afternoon, the dormitory acquiring its familiar noise again, Dean and Seamus arriving together with matching haircuts and the sort of cheerfulness that suggested a good Christmas. Harry moved through it with the wool jumper under his robe. He did not explain the jumper to anyone who didn't already know, and no one asked. The green pile of notes, retrieved from the library on the 2nd of January when the building was still mostly empty, had not resolved itself over the holiday. If anything, lying across the common room table in the quiet of an empty dormitory floor, it had looked more troubling, not less. Harry had added 3 lines in his own handwriting to the Quirrell section, and then had looked at them for a long time, and then had not added anything further because he was not yet sure what the lines proved. What they had, assembled across 2 weeks of thinking, was a shape rather than a certainty. Quirrell had been in the wrong place at the wrong time on Halloween, and the troll had come from the dungeons, and the dungeons were not where a troll wandered unassisted. Snape had been near the 3rd-floor door at night. Both men had reasons to want the stone, or at least reasons not to want anyone else to have it. And the reasons were, in Snape's case, opaque, and in Quirrell's case, something Harry couldn't articulate yet, but felt along the back of his neck when he sat in defense against the dark arts and watched Quirrell's hands move across the board. "We need to know what's past Fluffy," Hermione said, on a Thursday evening in the 2nd week of January, with the directness of someone who had been building up to this. "Not tonight, obviously, but we need to know what enchantments are on the stone itself, and we can't know without getting closer." "Getting closer means getting past a 3-headed dog," Ron said. "Getting closer means getting past the door," she corrected. "Fluffy is behind the door. There's a distinction. I'll keep that in mind when he's eating me." Harry was already thinking about the invisibility cloak, which Dumbledore had sent at Christmas in a parcel with no note, only a card that said it had been his father's. He had not told Ron or Hermione about it yet. He was not sure why. The cloak felt private in the way certain things did. Not secrets exactly, but possessions that needed time before they could be shared. He thought he would tell them soon. "Not yet," he said. "Not until we know more about what we're walking into." He looked at Hermione. "You're still on Flamel?" "I've found a reference," she said, with the controlled excitement of someone who had been sitting on information and was finally permitted to produce it. "Nicholas Flamel. He's an alchemist. 1490-something, French, and he's—" She paused for the effect of it. "He's still alive. He and his wife. He made the Philosopher's Stone." The common room fire shifted. Ron stared at her. "Still alive?" Harry repeated. "He's past 600 years old. The stone grants immortality, which means," she said, pulling the red pile toward her, "that whoever has it doesn't just have something valuable. They have the capacity to live forever and to turn metal into gold. The stone is essentially without limit." She set the pile down. "And someone is trying to steal it from Hogwarts." They stayed with this for a moment. The fire was very orange. "Right," said Ron. They went on the 19th. It was Harry's idea, and the cloak made it possible, the 3 of them moving through the corridors after midnight, and the castle was not as empty as it might have appeared from the outside. Mrs. Norris patrolled the second floor. A ghost, the Bloody Baron, silver-stained and purposeful, drifted through the fourth-floor corridor at a height that suggested he was not paying attention to the floor. Harry held the cloak over the three of them with both hands and thought about stillness, and they moved in a compressed and careful huddle that Hermione managed with the focus of someone doing precision work. The third-floor corridor smelled of something large and animal. Through the door, after a moment of listening, they could hear the particular low sound of something sleeping. Three somethings, breathing in loose synchrony. "The door has 2 protection charms on it," Hermione whispered, barely audible. "I can see them from here. Someone's been at them. The edge of the second one is," she squinted, "disturbed." "Someone's been through," Harry said, "or tried to." They moved further along the corridor, past the door, checking for signs of forced passage, of anything recently moved or examined. The stone floor was even. The walls were ordinary. And then Harry caught his foot on something, a loose nail head protruding from a wooden strut along the wall at approximately hip height, and felt the distinctive drag of fabric tearing, and stopped. He looked down. A 3-inch rip along the front panel of the grey charity shop robe. Clean and decisive. Underneath it, visible through the gap, the checked flannel of Dudley's shirt. He stood looking at it for a moment, with the particular flatness of someone absorbing a minor disaster on top of several significant ones. "Brilliant," he murmured, pressing the torn edge back into place with his thumb. Ron looked at the rip. Then he looked up. In the dark, whispering, his expression was entirely straight, except for the slight tension around his eyes. "At least Malfoy can't mock you for it," he said. "Everyone tears their robes eventually." Harry looked at him. "Very helpful," he said. "I try." Hermione looked at both of them with the expression she reserved for moments when she had decided that commenting would not improve things. Then she turned back toward the door. "The robe repair kit," she said quietly. "The one I gave you. It covers tears." Harry was aware that she was doing the thing she did, solving the problem rather than making anything of it, and was aware, too, that this was, in fact, more useful than sympathy would have been. He said nothing. He filed the rip alongside the other things that needed addressing and thought about the disturbed protection charm instead. They were back in the common room by 2 a.m, cloak folded over Harry's arm, nobody speaking until Hermione had put the kettle on the fire with the general air of someone who had earned it. "Quirrell," Harry said, and the word settled into the room like something that had been waiting. "Or Snape," said Ron. "Quirrell," Harry said again, more certain this time. He was not sure how to articulate why, except that Snape's behavior had the quality of surveillance, watching, blocking, protecting, while Quirrell's had the quality of a man performing a version of himself. "I think Snape knows," he said slowly, "but I think it's Quirrell who wants it." Hermione wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at the fire. "That doesn't mean Snape is trustworthy." "No," Harry agreed. "It doesn't." Snape was in a particular mood on the following Monday, which might have had nothing to do with anything, and which Harry had learned not to assume was coincidental. He moved through the potions dungeon with the slow, deliberate energy of someone who had decided to make the lesson difficult, and he found his way to Harry's workbench at the 20-minute mark with his hands folded behind his back and his eyes moving across the ingredients laid out with obvious intent. "Potter," he said, "your lace-wing flies. Have you any idea what you've done to them?" Harry had, in fact, done exactly what the board said to do with them. He did not say this. "Your instincts in this classroom are approximately as reliable as your wardrobe choices," Snape said, with the level precision of someone who had composed the sentence ahead of time. though I suppose we should not expect refinement from a boy who arrives at school in someone else's cast-offs. Poverty of dress suggests poverty of application. The dungeon was very quiet. 30 students arranged themselves in the precise posture of people who had decided not to react. 5 points from Gryffindor, Snape said, for nothing at all, and moved away. Harry stared at his lacewing flies. The anger was clean and cold in the way it had become over the past months. Not the hot, aimless variety of the early term, but something more like conviction. He breathed through his nose and did not speak. 2 benches to his left, barely audible, Hermione's voice came at the level of breath. Some of us earn our place. We don't inherit it from Death-Eater parents. She said it without looking up from her cauldron. Harry did not look at her. He heard Ron's sharp exhale through his nose, which was the sound Ron made when something had landed exactly right. Snape, halfway across the dungeon, did not break stride. Harry felt something release across his shoulders. Not fully, but partially. The specific relief of having a thing named, even quietly, even unsaid by him. He returned to his lacewing flies. McGonagall asked him to stay after Transfiguration on the Wednesday. She waited until the other students had gone, and then she closed the classroom door with a quietness that suggested the conversation was intentional rather than casual. "Your Quidditch form is improving," she said, which was clearly not what she had asked him to stay for. "Thank you, Professor." She looked at him for a moment, with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she had decided to be careful about. Her eyes moved, briefly and precisely, to the way his robe sat, the extra layer visible at the collar, the sleeves that ended at the wrong point on his wrists. She did not say anything about this directly. "Hogwarts is your home now, Mr. Potter," she said. "The staff are here to support you, all of the staff, in any matter." A pause, exact and deliberate. "That is not a formality. I want you to understand it as a statement of fact." Harry looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, and he recognized in her expression the quality of something being offered rather than extracted, and the offer was specific, even if it was not named. "I understand," he said. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once, and returned to her desk, and the conversation was over with the precision of a door closing cleanly. Harry walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment in the cold current of air that came from the window at the far end, and thought about the word home and what it required a place to do before the word could apply. He thought about Hagrid's fire and the pine-green jumper, and Ron saying good night in the dark. He thought about McGonagall's eyes moving to his collar and then back up again without expression. He stood there for a little while. Then he went to find Ron and Hermione, because Quidditch practice was in 2 hours, and the match was in 4 days, and the whole school would be watching, which meant the whole school would be looking at him, bright and public and visible in every direction. The thought had 2 edges. He was beginning to understand that the edges were not going away, only that he was learning to hold both of them at once without cutting himself. He found them in the corridor outside the library, the green pile tucked under Hermione's arm, Ron gesturing broadly about something that had clearly just occurred to him. They looked up when Harry approached, and for a moment, just a moment, some unspoken thing moved between the 3 of them. Not a conversation. The shape of one. Harry kept walking, and they fell into step beside him, one on each side, and no one said anything, which was its own kind of language. The match was on a Saturday, and Harry woke before anyone else. He lay in the grey pre-dawn, listening to the dormitory breathe, Ron's slow exhale, Neville's occasional shift, and thought about the Nimbus 2000, which was in the broom shed, and about the snitch, which was somewhere in the air above the pitch, and about the fact that in approximately 4 hours the entire school would be watching him. He had been watched before. He had been watched his whole life, in the particular way of someone who is noticed for the wrong reasons. This was different. He was not sure yet whether different meant better. He dressed quietly, pulling Dudley's shirt on first, then the pine-green jumper, then the grey robe. The robe repair kit had done its work on the tear from the corridor nail. The fabric was smooth again, the mend invisible unless you knew where to look. He knew where to look. He ran his thumb across it once, then stopped. The pitch was empty when he got there. He didn't fly, just stood at the edge of the grass in the cold, watching the goalposts at either end, the stands still and pale in the early light. The sky was the colour of something about to change its mind. He was still there when Wood arrived 40 minutes later, broom over his shoulder, and stopped short at the sight of him. "Couldn't sleep either," Harry said, before Wood could ask. Wood looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a captain assessing a variable. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and they walked the pitch together in silence, which was its own kind of preparation. The team assembled at 9:30. The changing room had the smell of cold air and nerves, and the particular noise of people performing confidence for each other's benefit. Harry changed into his Quidditch robes in the corner with the efficiency he had developed over months. Quick, economical, the minimum of exposure. The Gryffindor robes were scarlet and gold and fit properly, which still registered as a small surprise each time. He pulled them on and felt the weight of them settle across his shoulders, and something in him settled with it. He caught the snitch in 11 minutes. He didn't plan it. He was tracking the other seeker, Terence Higgs, a Slytherin third year with good instincts and a faster broom than Harry had expected. When he saw it, a glint of gold at the far end of the pitch, hovering at approximately the height of the Slytherin goalposts. He went for it without thinking, which was the only way to go for a snitch, and the crowd noise changed pitch around him as he accelerated, and then his fingers closed around something warm and fluttering, and the whistle went. The roar was physical. It hit him like a wave, and he nearly lost his grip on the broom. He landed to find his teammates already running toward him, and then Fred Weasley had him by the shoulders and was shaking him, and George was saying something that was lost in the noise, and Wood was making a sound that was not quite a word. Harry stood in the middle of it and felt, for a moment, entirely present, not performing, not managing, not calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit. Just there, in his body, in the noise, with the snitch still warm in his closed fist. The changing room afterward was loud and close and smelled of mud and sweat, and Harry navigated it the same way he navigated everything, with attention and economy. He was aware of the older players stripping down around him, the easy unself-consciousness of people who had been doing this for years, and he kept his movements small and his eyes forward, and changed quickly, the Quidditch robes off, and the grey robe back on before anyone had reason to notice the shirt beneath it. He was good at this by now. He had been good at it since September. He was almost done when he heard Angelina Johnson say something to Katie Bell about the catch, and Katie Bell laugh, and the sound of it was so uncomplicated, just two people being happy about a thing that had happened, that he had to look away for a moment and find a fixed point on the wall. Dumbledore was waiting outside. Not obviously waiting. He was standing near the path back to the castle with his hands folded, apparently examining the middle distance, and he turned when Harry emerged as though the timing were coincidental. Harry had been at Hogwarts long enough to know that nothing Dumbledore did was coincidental. "A remarkable catch," the headmaster said. 11 minutes. I believe that is a school record for a first year." "I didn't know there was a record," Harry said. There wasn't until today. Dumbledore fell into step beside him, unhurried, and they walked in the direction of the castle. The grounds were still busy with students making their way back from the stands, their voices carrying across the cold air. "How are you finding Hogwarts, Harry, now that you've had some months to settle?" Harry considered the question. It was the kind of question that had a surface answer and a real one, and Dumbledore's eyes, pale blue and attentive, suggested he was interested in the real one without being willing to ask for it directly. "It's good," Harry said. "Better than I expected. And your accommodations, your comfort, generally." The pause before comfort was small but deliberate. Harry felt it land. "Fine," he said. "I have everything I need." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment, not the searching look Harry had braced for, but something quieter, something that had the quality of a man choosing not to push a door that wasn't ready to open. "I am glad to hear it," he said, and his voice was even, and Harry could not tell whether he believed it or whether he was filing the answer alongside other things he had chosen not to force. "You have friends who care for you. That is not a small thing." "No," Harry agreed. "It isn't." They parted at the castle steps, Dumbledore continuing toward the main doors, and Harry turning toward the side entrance that led more directly to Gryffindor Tower. He stood for a moment after the headmaster had gone, looking at the stone arch of the doorway, and thought about the question that hadn't been asked, and the answer he hadn't given, and the particular shape of a conversation that moved around its own center without ever touching it. He thought about Hagrid saying, "I should have looked more closely." He thought about McGonagall's eyes moving to his collar. He thought about Dumbledore's pause before the word comfort and the careful way the headmaster had not followed it. They all knew something. None of them had asked him directly. He was not sure whether this was kindness or its opposite, and he was not sure he had the language yet to say which he would have preferred. He went inside. Ron and Hermione were in the common room, and the celebration that followed was the kind that happened in small spaces with people who meant it. No performance, just the three of them, and a plate of something Hermione had acquired from the kitchens, and Ron's running commentary on the match, which was detailed and occasionally inaccurate and entirely affectionate. Harry sat in the chair nearest the fire and ate and let the noise of it wash over him, and felt the warmth of the room settle into his hands. Later, when the common room had thinned and the fire had dropped to embers, Draco Malfoy appeared in the corridor outside the portrait hole. Harry saw him through the window as he went to close it, standing in the torchlight with Crabbe and Goyle at his shoulders, watching the Gryffindor common room with an expression that was trying to be contempt and landing somewhere closer to frustration. Their eyes met through the glass. Malfoy said something Harry couldn't hear. The shape of it was familiar, the particular movement of his mouth that preceded something about poverty or charity, or the gap between Harry's name and his circumstances. Harry watched him say it and felt the anger move through him, clean and cold and clarifying, and did not look away. Then he reached up and closed the window and turned back to the fire. And that was the end of it. He lay awake that night for a long time, not unhappily. The snitch was on the nightstand, still and gold in the dark. He had caught it. He had stood in the noise of the crowd and felt, for 11 minutes, like someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The grey robe was folded on the shelf beside Dudley's shirt, and the pine-green jumper was under his pillow where it had been since Christmas, and the anger about the shelf in Vernon's wardrobe was still there, low and steady. But it was not the only thing anymore. He thought about the end-of-year feast, which was still months away. He thought about the great hall and the long tables, and the particular quality of silence that fell when something unexpected happened in a public place. He was not ready. He knew that. But the thought had a shape now that it hadn't had before, and he turned it over in the dark and did not put it away. The thought had a shape, and then it had a date. Harry didn't decide it consciously. He was sitting in the library on a Tuesday in late May, the green pile of notes spread across the table, and Hermione was reading aloud from a defense textbook about possession, the signs of it, the physical markers, the way a possessed person's eyes moved, and Harry was listening and not listening, and then she said, "The end-of-year feast is in 3 weeks." And something in him went very still. 3 weeks. He looked at the green pile. He looked at the window, where the grounds were bright with late spring light. He thought about the great hall and the long tables, and the particular quality of attention a room full of people gave to something unexpected. "Harry," Ron said. "I know," Harry said, though Ron hadn't finished the sentence. Ron looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the green pile. Then he looked back at Harry with the expression he wore when he had understood something, and was waiting to see whether Harry wanted to talk about it. Harry did not yet. But the date was there now, fixed and real, and the thought had stopped being abstract. The stone crisis came before he was ready for anything else. It was Hagrid who gave it away, not meaning to. A comment about Fluffy, about music, about how easy it was to send a creature like that to sleep if you knew the trick. Harry heard it and felt the bottom drop out of the afternoon. They were in Hagrid's hut, the 3 of them, and Hagrid was pouring tea, and the words landed with the particular weight of information that changes the shape of everything around it. "Hagrid," Harry said carefully. "Who else have you told that to?" Hagrid's face did the thing it did when he realized he'd said something he shouldn't. "No one," he said. "No one. I might have mentioned it. To a stranger at the pub. He was very interested in Fluffy, very keen to know how I'd got him, and I might have said—" "What did he look like?" Hermione asked. Hagrid described a man with a turban. They left quickly, with the particular controlled urgency of people who have just understood that the timeline has moved without them. The evening air was warm, and the castle was lit gold from the west, and Harry walked between Ron and Hermione and felt the thought about the feast recede behind something more immediate. "It has to be tonight," he said. "We don't know that," Hermione said, but her voice had the quality of someone arguing against something they already believed. "Dumbledore's away. Hagrid told a stranger how to get past Fluffy. If Quirrell has been waiting for a window—" "Then we go tonight," Ron said. He said it simply, the way he said most things, and Harry felt the familiar relief of it, the absence of drama, the presence of decision. They went at midnight, under the cloak, the 3 of them pressed close in the corridor outside the 3rd-floor door. The protection charms were gone. Not disturbed, gone. The door swung open at a touch. What followed was the kind of experience that compressed time, the harp still playing, Fluffy asleep across the trapdoor, the drop into darkness, Devil's Snare, which Hermione handled with the focused efficiency of someone who had read about it and was now applying the reading, the key chamber, which Ron navigated with the particular spatial intelligence he brought to chess and apparently to flying broomsticks. The chess game itself, Ron's face, very still, very certain, moving pieces with the authority of someone who had stopped being afraid and started being useful. Harry watched him sacrifice himself and felt something cold move through his chest. "Go," Ron said, from the floor, and his voice was steady. "Both of you. Go." Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Ron. There was a moment, brief, complete, where the three of them existed in the particular clarity that came just before something irreversible. "I'll come back," Harry said. "I know," said Ron. The potion chamber was Hermione's. She worked through it in minutes, her hands steady, her voice even as she explained the logic of it. And Harry stood beside her and thought about how she had handed him a jumper at Christmas and called it surplus, and how she had muttered something about Death Eater parents in a dungeon, and how she was standing here now, solving a puzzle that stood between them and something that could kill them, and doing it without fuss. "The smallest bottle," she said. "It'll get you through the black flame." "And you?" "Enough to go back." She pressed the bottle into his hand. Her fingers were cold. "Harry, whatever happens, you know what to do." He did. He went through. Quirrell was already there. The mirror of Erist stood against the far wall, and Quirrell stood before it. And Harry understood in the space of a breath that he had been wrong about the shape of the threat. Not wrong about Quirrell, but wrong about what Quirrell was. The turban came off. The voice that came from the back of Quirrell's head was not Quirrell's voice. What followed was not a fight in any way Harry had imagined a fight. There was no wand, no spell, no choreography. There was the mirror and the stone appearing in his pocket with the logic of a dream, and Quirrell's hands on his face, and then the burning. Not metaphorical, not like anything he had a word for. His hands on Quirrell's skin. The sound Quirrell made. The way the man came apart. Then the floor. Then nothing. He woke to white light and the smell of something medicinal, and Dumbledore sitting in the chair beside the bed, with his hands folded, and his expression carrying the particular weight of a man who has been waiting and is relieved and troubled in equal measure. "The stone is destroyed," Dumbledore said, before Harry could ask. "Nicholas Flamel has been informed. Quirrell is dead. Voldemort has fled. He is not gone, but he is diminished, and he is not here." Harry lay with this for a moment. His hands were bandaged. His head felt distant from the rest of him. "Ron," he said. "Recovering. He will be perfectly well." A pause. "Miss Granger has not left the corridor outside this room since yesterday evening." Harry closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them. Dumbledore was watching him with the careful attention of a man who had decided to say something and was choosing the moment. "Harry," he said, "you will not be returning to Privet Drive before the summer." Harry looked at him. "I have made arrangements," Dumbledore said. "You will remain at Hogwarts. Hagrid has offered to stay on through July, and I have accepted on your behalf." He paused. "I should have made this arrangement sooner. I did not, and that is a failure I intend to address." The words were even and precise, and carried the quality of a man who had rehearsed them and was delivering them anyway, because they needed to be said. Harry thought about the pause before the word comfort after the Quidditch match. He thought about McGonagall's eyes moving to his collar. He thought about all the careful not asking, the oblique offers, the conversations that moved around their own center. "You knew," Harry said. "Before tonight. You knew something was wrong." Dumbledore did not look away. "I suspected," he said. "I did not ask directly. I believed, I told myself, that the protection required the arrangement to continue. That was not the whole truth." Another pause, shorter. "The whole truth is that I did not ask, because I was not certain I could bear the answer, and that was a cowardice I dressed as strategy." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the grounds were green and bright. Harry looked at his bandaged hands. He thought about the feast, which was in 2 weeks now, and the shape the thought had taken in the library, and the date that had fixed itself in him like a nail. "I'm going to tell them," he said. "At the feast. Everyone." Dumbledore was still for a moment. Then he said, "Tell them what, precisely? About the robes, about the Dursleys, about all of it?" Harry looked at him. "I think people should know." Dumbledore held his gaze for a long time. His expression was not the one Harry had expected. Not alarm, not the careful management of a man protecting a strategy. It was something quieter. Something that looked, if Harry was reading it correctly, like relief. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I think perhaps they should." Dumbledore left before visiting hours ended, and Harry lay in the hospital wing, listening to the castle settle around him, and turning the conversation over the way he had turned the snitch after the match, examining the weight of it, the temperature, whether it felt like what it was supposed to feel like. "Yes," Dumbledore had said. "I think perhaps they should." Harry had expected argument, careful management, a gentle steering towards silence. He had not expected the relief in the old man's voice, which had sounded less like permission and more like release. Ron appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, his left arm in a sling and his expression doing its level best to be casual. Hermione was behind him, her eyes still red at the edges, and she sat down on the chair Dumbledore had vacated and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "You're all right," not as a question, and Harry said, "Mostly." And that was the shape of it. The three of them, in the white light, alive. He was released the following morning. Madame Pomfrey gave him a small bottle of something orange and a list of instructions he was not going to follow, and he walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the early light with his bandaged hands and the knowledge that the feast was in 2 weeks. The exams arrived the way inevitable things did, first as a concept, then as a schedule pinned to the notice board, then as a physical weight pressing on the back of every day. The castle shifted its mood accordingly, the common room filling each evening with students crouched over notes and muttering incantations at pages, and Hermione became a kind of benevolent engine, driving the three of them through revision timetables she had color-coded and cross-referenced and annotated in her smallest handwriting. Harry sat beside her and studied, or appeared to study, while his mind kept sliding sideways toward arithmetic. 12 days, then 10, then 8. Ron noticed. Ron always noticed, in the quiet way he had of tracking the weather inside a room without ever commenting on the forecast. He passed Harry a chocolate frog one evening without being asked, and when Harry looked up, he was already looking back at his charms notes. And that was the whole of it, a gesture so ordinary it carried everything that didn't need to be said. Hermione noticed differently. She noticed with questions she was choosing not to ask, with the careful way she arranged her notes so that Harry always had working space and never needed to ask for it, with the extra warming charm she cast on the corner of the library table where he sat. She was preparing the ground. She had been preparing it all year. The McGonagall conversation happened on a Wednesday, at the end of a Transfiguration revision session that most of the other Gryffindors had attended, and Harry had spent only partially present. Professor McGonagall kept him behind with a glance, the specific glance that meant, "This is not about your marks," and waited until the sound of the others' footsteps had faded down the corridor. She did not sit. She stood at her desk with her hands folded, and her expression had in it something Harry did not often see in the faces of adults who spoke to him, a controlled but genuine discomfort, the discomfort of someone about to say a thing they had been rehearsing and still weren't certain of. "I want you to know," she said, "that whatever happens at the end of this year, or at the start of the next, the staff of this school consider you one of our own. Not because of your name, because of what we have seen you to be." She paused. I am not a woman who finds it easy to say that sort of thing plainly. So I am saying it plainly now, while there is still time." Harry's eyes stung. He looked at the window above her head and breathed carefully. He thanked her, and she nodded, once, and he left before either of them had to navigate whatever came after honesty. He walked back to the tower the long way, through the upper corridor and past the windows that looked out over the grounds, the evening light falling long and gold across the grass, and he thought about what she had said. Not the words exactly, but the quality of the saying. She had been steady. She had looked at him without the flinching pity he'd been bracing for, without the management he'd become fluent in deflecting, just directly. He was one of theirs. She had wanted him to know it before the year ended. He filed it alongside other things: Ron's chocolate frog, Hermione's timetables, the pine green jumper, which still lived under his pillow in the dormitory, because he had not been able to bring himself to move it. Hagrid's invitation arrived the following Saturday in the form of Hagrid himself, enormous and ruddy-faced, appearing at the castle steps and waving. Harry went alone, which was what Hagrid had asked for, though he hadn't needed to ask. Harry had understood from the particular way Hagrid had not lingered after the others that this was a different kind of visit. The hut was warm and smelled of something with enough ginger to be weaponized, and Hagrid poured tea into mugs the size of small buckets and sat down with the lumbering care of a man composing himself. He talked for a while about Norbert, gone now, smuggled out by Charlie Weasley's friends, and still missed in the particular way Hagrid missed things, which was thoroughly and without embarrassment. Then he set his mug down and looked at his hands. "I wrote to Dumbledore," he said, "back in February. Told him I was worried. About you, and about the Dursleys, and about whether things were all right there." He glanced up. "I know he's spoken to you. I'm not asking you to tell me what was said. I just wanted you to know that I did it." Harry looked at the fire. Something moved in his chest, loosening from somewhere it had been held for a long time. "I know you're going to say something," Hagrid continued, "at the feast. I don't know how I know, but I do." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you should. I think it's the right thing. And I think whatever happens after, you won't be facing it on your own. I want you to know that." He said it with the same plain stubbornness with which he said every difficult thing, as though it had not occurred to him that sincerity might be embarrassing, and Harry found that he could not speak for a moment. He stayed until dark and walked back to the castle in the late blue air, feeling scraped open and steadied in equal measure. The relief Hagrid had spoken of, he felt it now, and the terror alongside it, the same terror that had been sitting under everything, since the library and the date that had fixed itself in him. But it was different now. It had company. He gathered Ron and Hermione in an empty classroom on Monday, the day before exams began, in the late afternoon when the corridors were busy enough that no one would remark on a closed door. He shut the door and turned around, and found them already watching him with the patient attention of people who had been expecting this. "I'm going to tell them," he said. "At the feast, I'm going to stand up in the Great Hall and tell everyone about the Dursleys, the robes, all of it." Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," which was the most Ron sentence Harry had ever heard him produce, and it sat in the room like a hand on a shoulder. Hermione's reaction was more complex. He could see it moving across her face. The alarm first, real and unguarded, and then something behind it that was not precisely approval, but was its close relation, the expression of a person who had been watching someone arrive at a conclusion and is relieved they've got there. "Are you certain?" she said. "Yes," Harry said. She nodded, once, with the decisive quality she brought to the end of arguments and the beginning of plans. "Then we'll be there," she said. "Right beside you." He looked at the two of them, Ron leaning against the wall with his arms folded, still and certain. Hermione standing very straight in the way she did when she had committed to something, and felt the thought settle into a different register. Not abstract. Not a possibility. A plan with people in it who had chosen to be there. They went to dinner. The feast was in 4 days. The 4 days between the decision and the feast had a particular quality. Not the anxious, dilating quality of dread, but something more precise. Harry moved through his final examinations with the focused calm of a person who has already committed to the hardest thing on the schedule and is simply waiting for the rest of the schedule to end. He wrote his transfiguration paper. He performed his charms practical. He answered 12 questions about the properties of flobberworms in a room that smelled of damp ink and new-mown grass drifting through the open windows, and he was aware throughout all of it that the feast was happening on Thursday, and that on Thursday he was going to stand up in the great hall and tell 1,100 people the truth about his life. Ron sat exams with the pragmatic stoicism of a man who had studied exactly as much as he intended to study, and was at peace with the consequences. Hermione emerged from each one slightly flushed, and already reviewing her answers in her head, which Harry had come to understand as her equivalent of calm. Neither of them said anything about Thursday during the exam days. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said in the empty classroom. The plan existed. They were in it. Wednesday evening came. Harry sat on the window seat in the dormitory after dinner, watching the last light leave the grounds, and Ron came and sat on the other end of it without speaking, which was the right thing to do. After a while, Dean came up and mentioned that Seamus had brought chocolate frogs from home, and there were enough for everyone, and Harry went downstairs and sat with the others and ate chocolate and listened to Seamus argue with Neville about Quidditch in the easy, undemanding way of an evening that asked nothing from anyone. He slept better than he expected. Thursday arrived as days did, when they had been anticipated at length, without ceremony, the light simply coming through the windows the same as any other morning. He dressed with some attention. The hand-me-downs were Dudley's, as they had always been. A pair of trousers that bagged at the knee, a blue shirt with a fraying cuff, a grey pullover with a small hole near the left elbow that he had not bothered to repair. He looked at himself in the dormitory mirror for a moment. The mirror did not say anything. He pulled his robe on over all of it, the charity shop grey one that Hermione's kit had kept intact, and went downstairs. Hermione was already at the table when he reached the common room, her hands folded around a mug of something. She looked at him and did not say anything, and did not need to. The day was very long and not long at all. There were no lessons. The last examinations had finished the previous day, and the castle had a loose, end-of-term feeling. Students drifting to the grounds, or the library or the common rooms, with the idle energy of people released from obligation. Harry sat with Ron and Hermione near the lake in the afternoon, and they talked about things that were not Thursday, about the summer, about Hagrid's garden, about whether the giant squid had a name, and it was the kindest thing either of them could have done. The owls came at 6 with the last post of the term, and then the call went round for the feast, and Harry got up, and the three of them walked together through the entrance hall and into the great hall, where the candles were lit and the house banners hung, and the noise of 1,000 students rose warm and familiar from the long tables. He sat between Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table, which was where he always sat, and he looked down the table at the other first years, Neville flushed and cheerful, Dean and Seamus already arguing about something, Lavender Brown twisting the end of her plait and talking to Pavati, and felt the particular bitter-sweet weight of the last time. This version of the year. The version before Thursday became something that had happened. The food appeared, and the hall filled with the sound of it. Plates and laughter, and the low roar of 500 conversations going at once. Harry ate a little. Ron ate considerably more. Hermione ate with the steady deliberateness of a person managing themselves carefully. Dumbledore rose at the end of the meal, and the hall settled by degrees, the way large crowds settled, patchily and then completely. He stood at the head of the staff table in his midnight blue robes, and his voice carried without effort to every corner of the room. He spoke of the year that was ending, its challenges, its celebrations, its losses. He announced the house points with his usual precision. Gryffindor had won the House Cup, and the Gryffindor table erupted, and Harry felt the surge of it move through him alongside something else entirely. Then Dumbledore turned to the farewells, the formal thanks, the ceremonial close of the year that was the same every June at every school that ran on a calendar, and Harry sat with his hands folded on the table and felt his pulse in his throat. Dumbledore reached the close of his remarks. He said something about the summer, about returning in September, about the doors of Hogwarts being always open to those who needed them. He began to sit. Harry stood. The motion brought immediate attention. A Gryffindor first year at the far end of the table, rising in the wrong moment. The noise around him stilled in a ripple outward, one table, then the next, until the hall had gone the particular quality of silence that is not quiet but suspended. He felt it happen, felt the weight of 1,100 pairs of eyes finding him, and held very still under the weight of it. Ron's hand closed around his wrist, not pulling him back, just present. Hermione, on his other side, gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible. Dumbledore had paused mid-motion, half-seated, his expression unreadable. McGonagall, 2 seats along the staff table, had gone very still. Snape's lip had begun to curl, the reflex of a man anticipating a spectacle. Harry looked out at the hall. It looked back. "My name is Harry Potter," he said, and his voice came out steady, which surprised him. "And there is something I need to say before the year ends. It concerns all of you, but most of all it concerns the people whose job it is to look after children." He reached up and unfastened the clasp of his robe. He heard the breath that moved through the room when the robe came off. A collective intake, soft and sharp at once. He laid the grey robe on the bench beside him, and stood in Dudley Dursley's pullover and Dudley Dursley's trousers and the fraying cuff of Dudley Dursley's shirt, and looked at what they looked like on him, the bagging fabric, the worn elbows, the pullover's hem reaching past his hips, because Dudley Dursley was 4 stone heavier and 5 inches broader. Lavender Brown covered her mouth with both hands. Neville went very pale. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy's face had done something complicated. Confusion first, genuine and unguarded, and then something behind it that was working toward cruelty, and had not yet arrived. "I wore these every day this year," Harry said. "Under my robes. I had proper robes. Madame Melkin's. Bought in Diagon Alley. Bought with my own money from my parents' vault. My uncle took them when I got home. Locked them away. He said wizard clothing wouldn't be worn under his roof." He paused. His hands were trembling. He let them. "These belong to my cousin Dudley. Everything I wore this year did. He is considerably larger than me." The hall did not move. Even the candles seemed to be holding still. The robes were the least of it. His voice wavered when he got to the part about Dudley being overfed while Harry went without. He heard the waver and could not stop it, so he let it pass and steadied on the other side of it. He said the cupboard under the stairs plainly, the way he had practiced saying it in his head, because, if he said it plainly, It could not be made to sound like less than what it was. He did not dress it up, and he did not soften the shape of it. He stated the facts. The locked door. The small, dark space. The deliberateness of it. Snape's sneer had gone. Harry noticed that without looking directly at him, a peripheral absence, like a sound that had stopped. Dumbledore sat very straight and very still at the head of the table, and his expression was the one Harry had seen in the hospital wing. Not management, not strategy, gravity. The expression of a man receiving something he has owed someone for a long time. "I was ashamed," Harry said, and his voice was clear now, not wavering, the way it got when he had said the hardest part already, and the rest was just the thing that needed saying. "I hid all of it because I was ashamed, and because I didn't think anyone would believe me, and because I didn't know that it wasn't normal. I know now." He looked out at the hall, the hundreds of faces still and watching. "I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm telling you because the people who did this to me should not be allowed to do it to anyone else." He sat down. The silence held for a moment longer, stretched, unbroken, the whole room a single held breath. Then Dumbledore rose. He did not move quickly. He came to his feet with the deliberate weight of a man who understood that the room was watching, and that the room needed to see him move toward Harry rather than away, and he descended from the staff table and crossed the floor of the great hall in the silence that Harry had made, and when he reached the Gryffindor table, he stood beside Harry and placed one hand on his shoulder. Not comfort, acknowledgement. Harry felt the difference and did not know how to name it, only that the hand was not there to soothe or manage or redirect. It was there to say, "I am standing here. Everyone can see me standing here. Whatever happens next, this is where I am." McGonagall was already on her feet. She came around the end of the staff table with a speed that was at odds with her usual precise containment, and she had her own robe, not a spare, her actual outer robe, the tartan-edged one she had worn every evening feast that Harry could remember, and she draped it around his shoulders without asking, without ceremony, with the firm and wordless efficiency of a woman who had decided the deciding was over and the doing had begun. The robe was far too large for him. He felt it settle around him, like something that meant to stay. Then she turned to Dumbledore. "This child," she said, and her voice was measured, but there was fire underneath it, the particular fire of a woman who had been managing herself all year, and was managing herself still, but intended to be heard. Should never have been returned to that house. Not once. Not for a single summer. "No," Dumbledore said. He did not say it defensively. He said it the way a man said something that had been true for years and had only just been said aloud. He should not. Professor Sprout had pressed both hands to the table as though she needed to brace against something. Flitwick, small and precise in his usual seat, was looking at Harry with an expression Harry had never seen on him before, something between grief and the particular kind of outrage that came from fondness. McGonagall's voice was still steady, but her colour was high and her eyes were bright, and Harry understood that she was furious. Not at him, not at the hall, but at the years of it, the accumulated years of it, at whatever meetings had occurred or not occurred, and whatever decisions had been made or not made in the space between October 1981 and today. She sat, finally. The robe stayed where it was. The hall was beginning to fracture. At the Gryffindor table, Ron was on his feet. He stood with the same uncomplicated solidity with which he did everything, and he started applauding, not the roaring enthusiasm of a Quidditch victory, but a slow, deliberate clap that said, I know this person, and I am choosing this. Dean Thomas stood. Then Seamus. Then Neville, who was blinking hard, and whose hands, when he brought them together, were not entirely steady. Lavender had lowered her hands from her mouth and was looking at Harry with an expression so raw and open it was almost uncomfortable to see. She stood and began to clap as well. The Hufflepuff spread it. It moved table to table the way fires moved, catching on the Hufflepuff benches first. A whole row standing at once, because Hufflepuffs did things together. And then the Ravenclaws, less uniform but no less decided. An older Ravenclaw girl Harry didn't know was standing with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, which was apparently her version of the same statement. The applause built and built, and Harry sat in the middle of it with McGonagall's robe around his shoulders and did not know what to do with his face. At the Slytherin table, it was more fractured. Most of them did not stand. Pansy Parkinson was staring at the tablecloth. Crabbe and Goyle were looking at Draco for instruction, and Draco was not giving it, because Draco was looking at Harry with an expression that had made its journey. From confusion to the beginning of cruelty, and had stalled somewhere in between, and not moved. He was 11 years old, and he was looking at another 11-year-old in hand-me-down clothes that were 6 sizes too large, and somewhere between the concept of mockery and the reality of it, there was a gap that he had not prepared for. He did not stand. He also did not speak. Harry looked at him for 1 second, and then looked away, because he had not done this for Draco Malfoy, and he did not need Draco Malfoy's reaction to determine whether it had been worth doing. Hermione was not applauding. She was sitting very still beside Harry with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward him, and when he looked at her she looked back, and there were tears on her face that she had not wiped away, which was the most significant thing, because Hermione Granger did not leave anything unmanaged that could be managed. She had left them. She was looking at him with her face completely open. "You were brilliant," she said quietly, underneath the noise of the hall, and Harry looked back at the crowd and breathed. Dumbledore raised one hand and the hall settled. He stood at the center of the floor, Harry's robe folded over his arm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the way it always did, not loudly, simply fully, reaching every corner without effort, the voice of a man who had addressed large rooms for a very long time. "What Mr. Potter has done tonight required a courage of a different order to the courage we typically celebrate in these walls," he said. "I want you to hear me say clearly, so that no one in this room can leave uncertain of it. What was done to this boy was wrong. It was neglect. It was deliberate deprivation. It was cruelty performed by people who understood exactly what they were doing." He paused. The room was absolutely still. The fact that it occurred outside the walls of Hogwarts does not make it outside our concern. It should have been our concern from the beginning. The failure to make it so was mine. Snape's face was unreadable. Harry glanced at him from the corner of his eye and found nothing there that he could classify. Not guilt, not contempt, not the managed blankness Snape wore in the hallway. Something else. Something settled and still, as though Snape was doing the same arithmetic Harry had done in the library and arriving somewhere on the other side of it. "Effective immediately," Dumbledore continued, "Harry will remain at Hogwarts during the summer holidays. He will be safe, and he will be comfortable, and he will have everything a child in this school is entitled to have." He did not look at the staff table when he said it, but Harry felt McGonagall's posture change beside him, a satisfaction, brief and private, quickly stilled. "Additionally, I have this evening sent word to the Magical Child Welfare Authority. An investigation into the conduct of Mr. Potter's guardians will begin within the week. I intend to cooperate with it fully and to provide them with everything they require." murmuring now, not alarmed, more the sound of a room absorbing something significant and needing a moment for the absorption. "I will not tell you," Dumbledore said, and his voice shifted into a register Harry had not heard before, something stripped of its usual warmth, direct and almost austere, that the wizarding world has a spotless record of attending to the welfare of its children. We do not. We have long relied on the assumption that children placed in magical homes, or magical schools, or magical care are safe, without scrutiny, without oversight, without the simplest questions. Harry Potter has been in this room with us for nearly an entire year. None of us asked the right questions. He stopped. He let that sit. We will do better. We must. And I thank this young man for having the bravery to make certain that we no longer had the option of not knowing. He looked down at Harry. Harry looked back. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness exactly, because Harry was not certain forgiveness was his to give for things that had been done to him over years, and in the presence of people who could have stopped them. But it was something in that family, an acknowledgement, an account opened honestly, finally, between them, with all the figures visible. "Right," said Dumbledore quietly, only for Harry. "Then we begin." The days after the feast had a different texture to them, looser, quieter, the castle exhaling after a long year, held taut. Harry woke the morning after to find McGonagall's tartan robe folded on the chair beside his bed. He did not remember bringing it upstairs. He sat with it in his lap for a moment, feeling the weight of the wool, and then he set it carefully aside and got dressed in Dudley's clothes for what he understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, was one of the last times. The other Gryffindors were packing. Trunks stood open across the dormitory floor, and the room had the particular chaos of an ending. Half-folded robes, chocolate frog cards sorted into piles, Seamus arguing with Dean about whose exploding snap set was whose. Harry sat on his bed and watched it, and felt something he could not immediately name. Not grief, not quite joy. Something in between, the feeling of a door standing open that had been shut for a very long time. Ron appeared in the doorway with 2 pieces of toast and handed one to Harry without comment, which was the right thing to do. "Mum wrote," Ron said, settling onto his own bed and eating with the uncomplicated appetite of a person who had slept well. "She wants you to come in July. She said—" He paused, chewing. "She said she's already written to Dumbledore, and he said yes, so it's not really a question." Harry looked at the toast in his hand. She didn't have to do that. She wanted to. Ron said it simply, the way he said things that were simply true. "She's been wanting to since Christmas, I think. She just didn't know how to ask without it being—" He gestured vaguely. "You know." Harry did know. He took a bite of toast. Hermione found them an hour later in the common room, her trunk already packed, and her expression carrying the particular brightness of someone who had been thinking carefully and had arrived somewhere. She sat down across from them and folded her hands in her lap. "My parents wrote to Dumbledore," she said. "They offered their house for the summer." Harry opened his mouth. "He declined," she said, "but he thanked them. He said—" She paused, and something moved across her face that was not quite hurt and not quite relief. "He said you needed to learn to trust institutional protection alongside personal friendship. That Hogwarts could be a home, not just a school." She looked at Harry steadily. "I think he was right. I also think he was saying it partly to himself." Harry thought about Dumbledore standing in the great hall with his hand on Harry's shoulder, saying the words he had owed someone for a long time. He thought about the expression on Dumbledore's face when he said them. Not relief, not absolution, but the particular gravity of a man beginning to pay a debt he knew he could not fully repay. "Tell your parents thank you," Harry said. "Tell them it meant something." Hermione nodded. Her eyes were bright. She did not say anything else, which was its own kind of eloquence. In the days that followed, other students came to Harry in ones and twos, not with pity, which he had braced for, but with something more tentative and more honest. A Hufflepuff third year, who said quietly that her stepfather had done something similar and she had never told anyone. A Ravenclaw boy who apologized for laughing when Snape had mocked Harry's robes in the corridor back in October, his face red with the effort of saying it. Neville, who sat beside Harry at breakfast one morning and said nothing at all but stayed for an hour, which was enough. Draco Malfoy said nothing. He passed Harry twice in the corridor, and both times his face did something complicated and unresolved, and both times he looked away first. Harry watched him go and felt, not triumph, but a kind of tired clarity. Draco was 11 years old and had been handed a set of beliefs like furniture, arranged before he arrived, not chosen. What he did with them from here was his own business. Snape was absent from the collective staff response in the days that followed, as Dumbledore had indicated he would be. Harry saw him once, crossing the entrance hall with his robes moving around him in the usual way, and Snape looked at Harry with an expression that was not the sneer, and was not warmth, and was not guilt exactly. It was something more complicated than any of those, something that had not yet resolved into a shape Harry could read. Harry held his gaze for a moment, and then walked on. Whatever Dumbledore was addressing with Snape, it was between them. Harry had said what he needed to say in the Great Hall. The rest was not his to carry. McGonagall came to find him on the last morning. She knocked on the dormitory door and waited, which was not her usual approach, and when Harry came out into the corridor, she handed him a small brass key. "The trunk is in my office," she said. "Your Madame Malkin robes. I've had them cleaned and pressed. They'll fit you properly now." A pause, brief and controlled. "Or near enough. You've grown." Harry took the key. It was warm from her hand. "They'll be kept as evidence for the investigation," she said, "but you'll have them back when it's concluded. I've made certain of that." She looked at him with the directness she always used, the look that did not soften things, but did not make them harder than they were. "You did a brave thing, Mr. Potter. Not the kind of brave that gets celebrated at Quidditch matches. The other kind." Harry turned the key over in his fingers. "I was frightened," he said. "Yes," McGonagall said. "That's what makes it the other kind." She left before either of them had to manage what came after, which was, Harry had come to understand, her particular form of kindness. On the final morning, when the trunks had gone down, and the carriages were waiting, and the castle had the hollow, echoing quality of a place between one thing and the next, Harry stood with Ron and Hermione in the empty Great Hall. The long tables were bare, the candles were unlit, sunlight came through the high windows in long, pale columns, and lay across the stone floor in shapes that shifted slowly as the clouds moved outside. He was thinner than he should have been. He knew that. He could feel it in the way his clothes hung, in the way McGonagall's robe had swallowed him whole. The marks of the years were still on him. They did not disappear because he had named them. But his shoulders were straighter than they had been in September, and the weight he had carried since before he could remember, the weight of the secret and the shame of it, had lifted in the way that things lifted when they were finally set down. Not all at once, but enough to breathe. Hermione squeezed his hand. She did not say anything. She had already said what needed saying. Ron grinned at him, the wide, uncomplicated grin of a person who was genuinely happy and saw no reason to be subtle about it. "Next year," he said, "you arrive in proper robes. Ours or new ones doesn't matter. You won't be hiding." Harry looked at the empty hall, the bare tables, the pale light, the high ceiling that had held the sound of 1,100 people the night he had finally told the truth. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about the top shelf of Vernon's wardrobe. He thought about Dudley's pullover with the hole near the elbow, and the way he had stood in front of the dormitory mirror on the last morning of the year, and looked at himself in it for the last time. He thought about Ron's hand on his wrist, Hermione's single nod, McGonagall's robe settling around his shoulders like something that meant to stay. He nodded. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, he believed it. The story of the hand-me-downs was ending. The story of Harry Potter, truly known